This learning module is on Japanese names and biographical issues in Japan. So let's start with names. In East Asian languages, not just Japanese, but Chinese, Japanese, and Korean, the surname, the family name, comes first, as we've seen in our bibliographies and things like that. And then that name is followed by the given name. So for example, the name Moriogai, in that name Moriogai, Mori is the family name and Ogai is the given name. Truth is, that's a pen name that he chose himself. But let's treat it like the given name here. There are no middle names. Middle names seem really weird to the Japanese. So here's some examples of name structure in East Asia. We're going to be focusing on Japan, of course, but as a contrast object, I wanted to throw in China and Korea also. So in China, almost all the surnames are one character. There's a few that aren't, but almost all are one character. And the given names are usually 1 or 2 characters long. In Korea, we see the same pattern. So the surname is 1 character, and the given name will be 1 or 2 characters. In Japan, though, the surname could be anywhere between 1 and 3, and we tend to see 2 as a fairly common example. And the given name can be typically 1 to 3 characters. So here are some examples of Japanese surnames. Hayashi, very common surnames, that's 1 character. Suzuki, 2 characters. Miyata, 2 characters, and Setouchi, 3 characters. And the given name examples, Akira, and that's certainly not the only way to write Akira, which we'll be looking at in another few minutes, Kyoko, Sachiko, and Osamu. So we've got 1 character names and 2 character names. What about kanji and kana? Note that although most names today are written with kanji, occasionally parents will give their children a name written only in kana, and the trend to do that waxes and wanes over time. It also happens more often with girls than with boys. The kanji that are used in names in Japan are governed by the government's rules on kanji use, in other words, the Ministry of Education. As of 2004, there were 2,232 name kanji, the so-called Jinmei-yo kanji, and those are a subset of the Joyo kanji. So of that set of 2,232, parents can choose any of those and assign it to their child. And the reading is an entirely different story. We'll get to that in a minute. But the kanji is limited by the government to that set so that it ensures that names can be written and read by those literate in Japanese. So you don't end up faced with a kanji that you're really unfamiliar with, even if you're an educated, literate person. Now, I find this really striking in terms of statistics. There are approximately 3,000 surnames in Mandarin Chinese. However, Zhang, Wang, and Li account for 16% of the total. Think of that as sort of the Smith and Jones and Johnson, if you will, of the Chinese world. In the Korean context, there are approximately 260 surnames, but Kim, Yi, Pak, and Chong account for more than 50% of the population. I just find that fascinating. 4 surnames, and that's 50% of the population. What about Japan? In Japan, there are over 100,000 surnames, and we'll be looking at the history of that later on today. Very common surnames include Tanaka, Yamamoto, Suzuki, and Sato, but certainly out of 100,000, there are more than that. So there's no parallel between that Chinese example and the Chinese and Korean examples and the Japanese example of just a handful of surnames accounting for a large percentage of the population. So you have much more variety in the Japanese context. First, I want to talk about trends. There are naming trends in every culture, I think. Until the late 8th century, men's names often ended in maro. And here we have a picture of Kakinomoto Hitomaro, who was one of the really important poets of the Manyoshu. Hopefully, the Manyoshu as a title rings a bell with you. Remember Manyogana, that early poetry anthology. So Kakinomoto Hitomaro, who's usually just referred to as Hitomaro, was one of the major compilers and poets in that. After that period, men's names often took on a four-syllable structure, something like Narihira. We see Ariwara Narihira on the left, or Michinaga, Fujiwara Michinaga, both very famous courtiers from the Heian period. And in the Tokugawa, men's names often had the suffix emon. Okay, Doraemon isn't from the Tokugawa period, but I thought it would be fun to stick the name in there so that emon actually carries over into the modern age. We see emon still today, not so much in people's names, but in names, for example, in this case, of a manga character, an anime character. I've also seen it on a series of mugicha, soft drinks, things like that. How about on the female side? Before the 9th century, women's names mostly ended in me or iratsume or toji. For example, Otomo no Sakanoe no Iratsume was a famous poet, again from the Manyoshu. She's one of the first prominent female poets of Japan. In the 16th century, women's names began to take on the prefix of o to express affection. And then in the mid-Meiji, we see another trend. Only 5% of women's names were written in kanji. Between 1929 and 1933, however, 70% of women wrote their names in kanji. And today, as I was saying, more women will write their names in kanji and fewer in kana, but it is not tremendously unusual for parents to give their baby girl a name that is only written in kana, for which there is no kanji. In the mid-Meiji period, only 5%, oh, I said that one already, go Ben. But here you have the photo that goes with it. Today, male names often end in one of the following: ro, which means sun, but if you change the kanji, it could also mean clear or bright. For example, ichiro. Ta, great or thick, like kenta. Or they could contain an element that indicates their birth order. Ken-ichi means the first son. Kazuhiro likewise would be a first son. Jiro is a second son because that ji is tsugi, as in next. So if you see a number in a name, it often indicates birth order in a family. Female names often end in ko, child, like Keiko, or mi, beauty, Yumi. Other popular endings for female names include ka, which can be written with a couple different characters, as in Hashimoto Reika on the left, or na, meaning greens, like Ono Haruna on the right. Reading names in Japanese is difficult, to put it mildly. Parents, first of all, like to give their children distinctive names, so it's not uncommon for someone to see a name in kanji and really not know how to pronounce it. It doesn't matter if you're a native speaker or not. Indeed, names often take a different reading than what you might expect. In other words, readings that you will not find in a typical dictionary, even a name dictionary. Because, okay, parents are limited by the kanji they can choose. The government limits that. But they can assign any reading they want to that kanji. They just fill in the furigana on the form, and there it is. It's really kind of crazy, and sometimes it can get just out of hand. So let me give you some examples of names. And this is not an example of a given name that's out of hand. This is an example of a surname that's out of hand. If you look up those characters that we have here on the screen, right here, in a typical Japanese dictionary, say your Nelson's, you'll find that the possible readings for each character are as follows. So that first one's got a whole bunch of possible readings. You should probably know this kanji. It means long. So it can be read chojiru, chozuru, nagarareru, nagameru, takeru, nagai, nagaki, etc., etc., etc. So we got lots of different readings. These are all the kunyomi. And then down here we've got the onyomi, cho. How about this kanji? That one, if you look up, it has 3 different possible readings, koku, tani, or ya. And this kanji, if you look it up, will give you these 2 readings, sen and kawa. So now my question to you is, okay, given that information, how do you think you read that last name right there? And this is a really common last name. Go ahead, think about it. Stop the video, give yourself some time if you want, or just keep listening. These characters, when they're put together into a name, are read Hasegawa. Yes, Hasegawa. I'm not kidding. Hase is nowhere in that list of readings for the kanji nagai. But here, that's how it gets read, ha. And then this one takes on se as a reading. And, well, you can guess where the kawa comes from, but those first 2 are just inscrutable. Here's another example. How about you look up these characters in a dictionary? We got go-ju, and then this last one is arashi. It means a storm. I wouldn't expect you to know arashi, but you certainly know go-ju. So you look up those characters in your Nelson's, and you'll find here are the basic readings. Got a couple of 3 for the first one, 3 for the second one, 2 for the third one. But in the context of it being a name, the reading is not what you would expect. It is igarashi. Yes, igarashi. No, I'm not making a mistake. It really is amazingly inscrutable. Let me give you a couple other examples. Family names are sometimes written with ateji. So for example, these characters that you see on your screen here that I'm highlighting would normally be read as Shigatsu Tsuitachi, April 1st. But when they're a family name, it's read Wata Nuki, which means unpadded clothes, because April 1st is the traditional date to switch from winter to summer clothes. And indeed, we have an example here of a manga character whose name is Watanuki, and it's spelled like that. Here's another one. In the same way, these characters would normally be read as kotori asobi, little birds play. Or, if you're going to go with the onyomi, shocho yu. But when these are put together in the context of a name, we read them takanashi, because little birds, kotori, play asobi where there are no hawks. There are no nashi, hawks, taka. So it's takanashi. And indeed, here we have another example of a manga character who has that name, Takanashi. Here's some other weird and difficult stuff about Japanese. Popular names, such as Akira, one of the most popular male names, can be written in dozens of different ways. I've listed some of them here on the left in the slide. On the right-hand side, what we're looking at is the entry in a name dictionary I'm going to be mentioning later on in this lecture. Look at that. It starts up here at the top, Akira. How many different characters can be used to write the name Akira? Look at that list. It is downright scary, and it's not entirely exhaustive. Though the characters that appear there have some standing in history. In other words, somebody somewhere at some time used those characters to assign the name Akira to their child. So you can see how difficult names can be. So what is a student to do? Throw her arms up in the air and just give up? No. there, there are some strategies for reading names. Before I mention the different books that I'm going to recommend, I'll also say that learning how to read names is like learning how to identify the radical in a kanji. It's something that takes time and patience and experience. So you have to be patient with yourself about it. I've been in Japanese studies for a very long time, going on 30 years now, and when I come upon a name, I would guess probably 80% of the time I know it right off. Uh, and then maybe 10% more of the time I have to stop and really think about it and make some guesses. 10% of the time I don't know how to read it. I'm not sure. And I have to resort to some of these resources that I'm going to talk to you about. So you should expect that skill to come with time. All right, so let's say you want to know how to read a name. And I mentioned this before, but I'll mention it again. Needing to know how to read a name is particularly onerous on people who are living outside of Japan, people who are functioning outside of the Japanese language for a large part. Why is that? Well, as I mentioned when we were looking at bibliographies, if a Japanese person uses a Japanese source and wants to cite it but doesn't know how to read the name out loud, it doesn't matter because all he or she has to do is recreate the kanji on the page. But for us, outside of Japan, when we're writing a bibliography, for example, or a footnote, and we're citing it, we need to provide the romanization and the kanji. And so we often have to go the extra mile to figure out how to read a name. And that often ends up, for me at least, means that I have to go to the internet, I Google the characters, I hope that the person has published something that's been well cataloged, and the catalog entry may tell me how to read the name. That said, I have had the experience, and I think many scholars of Japanese have had this experience, in which you're trying to find out how to read a name and you find two sources that are both reliable that disagree. In that case, you really just have to kind of go with your gut. So this is not a clear-cut situation. The first book that I'd like to recommend to you as an undergraduate is P.G. O'Neill's Japanese Names. I did not require this book for this course because it would really only pertain to this particular learning module, but I strongly recommend it. It's not very expensive. You can find used copies. You can buy it, I think, still in paperback. It is not an expensive thing to have, and if you're going to be doing any work in Japanese studies, any serious work in Japanese studies, it is a very useful resource. And in later slides, in just a few minutes, I'm going to walk you through how it's organized. But before I get there, I also want to mention a couple other resources. Of course, Jim Breen, remember Jim Breen? We did it way back when we were looking at online dictionaries. Jim Breen's webpage and his dictionary has a subsection of names, and so you can also use that to find the way that some kanji are read. In a slightly different realm, you could use a Jinmei Jiten. Jinmei, a person name dictionary. However, there's a caveat here. Most Jinmei Jiten are not really name dictionaries. They're biographical dictionaries, and that's a different animal. A biographical dictionary, which we're going to look at right at the end of this lecture, contains information, extensive information about real people in history. So in that sense, it's quite different than O'Neill's, which is simply a lexicon of names and how to read them with a little bit of extra information put in there. There are a few other name dictionaries out there, but I'm not going to mention them because I don't think they're necessarily better, and they are certainly much more expensive. My only beef with O'Neill's is that in my own experience, it tends to be kind of Honshu-centric. So I've spent a lot of my time in Japan in Kyushu, for example, and have friends whose surnames are not in O'Neill's. And after a little bit of experiment, I concluded that that was because O'Neill was really focusing on sort of central Japan and not so much on the periphery. That said, it's still a really good resource. And before I go any further, I also want to point out just one little thing. A lot of people, a lot of Japanese prefer to use complex kanji when they write their names, even if simplification has already been adopted when they're born. It just kind of, I guess it adds a little bit of class to somebody's name. So as an example here, I have a picture of Onizawa Keiichi, who chooses to write his name like this. The Zawa is complex. But you could also Google him under this and find him. So if you're looking for a name and it doesn't come up right away, remember that you might need to consider a complex version and or a simplified version depending on what you're starting with. Okay, so let's look a little more closely at O'Neill's Japanese name so that you understand what it is. It's organized in two ways, in two big sections, front and back. The first part is organized from the kanji to the reading. So if you're looking at a kanji and you don't know how to read it, you can look it up and find assorted possible readings. And then the second half is done in the opposite direction. So you can look up names. It's not done by IUO, it's actually done by ABC and it's in romanization, but same idea. So a phonetic presentation, and then it will give you the various kanji that could be read that way. And I'm going to show you examples of that. The one thing I also wanted to point out, though, is that O'Neill's doesn't have details. For example, it doesn't give you birth and death dates of people or anything like that. It does give you basic information, as you'll see. It includes people's names and place names. So actually, its title, a Jinmeiji-ten, is a little bit deceptive because it is both a Jinmeiji-ten and also a Chi-meiji-ten, Chi as in place. Or Earth. And so a Jinmeiji-ten is a geographical dictionary. We're going to be looking at Jinmeiji-ten later on in a different learning module. But O'Neill's covers both of those because people names and place names in Japanese suffer from the same sorts of bibliographic problems. In other words, you often see a place name and you're not really sure how to pronounce it. To be fair, there's a lot of places in the United States that are like that. Even though we're functioning with, in theory, a phonetic system, I'm sure you can think of places near your hometown, if not your hometown itself, whose name is pronounced differently than outsiders might think. One of my favorite examples is there's a town in New Jersey called Bogota, which anybody else would look at and think it's Bogota, but they pronounce it Bogota. In Ohio, there's a town called Ashtabula, which I think anybody on the outside would pronounce Ashtabula, but in Ohio, it's pronounced Ashtabula. There it is. Okay, here's an example of a page from O'Neill's, and this is the page where we're looking something up phonetically, and then we're looking to see what the kanji possibilities are. So let me give you a little bit of a tour, if you will, of this kind of entry. And I know this is kind of small in the screen, so I'm going to blow it up a little bit. And we'll look at what our possibilities are. Now, this particular page starts with the surname Saizo. Well, actually, that Saizo begins on the previous page. And so that this little squiggly line that you see means that the name is Saizo Ryoku. And here, Saizo Ryu. These were real people, okay? And the M means male, and the L means literary. And here we have the kanji for his name. But that's all the information that we get. We get how to pronounce his name. We know he was a historical figure in literature. We don't know when he was born. We don't know when he died. We don't know anything else. So that's the kind of information we would find in a bibliographic dictionary, but not here. Likewise, Saizo Ryu, or this is actually Saito, right? Ryu is a male figure, a literary male figure. Eventually, we get out of that subcategory, that subgroup, and we get to Saizo, and that's it. It's not a double name. It's not Saito Ryoku or Saito Ryu or Saito Sanki or anything like that. Okay. Instead, it's Saizo and then an M. This means that this is a male name, but it's not referring to a specific person in history. In other words, probably more than one male has been named using those kanji in history. What are these numbers? We can probably make a guess. This dictionary, like most dictionaries, assigns a discrete number to each kanji. And so, for example, here, 1803 is the number of that first kanji in the two kanji compound. So you could look this up. You could sort of reverse look it up if you wanted to. Saizo Shu. This is not a person's name, and actually it's not a geographical name either. It's a literary title. That's what the L is. Remember, L stands for literary. So the dictionary includes quite a lot. Down here we have Saji with an S and a P. The S means that this can be a surname, and the P means that it can be a place name. Likewise, Sajie is a man's name, a masculine name, a male name, etc., etc. So some of these are kind of generic names. Some of them are actual people in history. Some of them are literary titles. Some of them are place names. There's quite a variety here. So this is that part of the dictionary where you're going from phonetics over to kanji. How about that other part? Here's what a page looks like in the part where you're starting with the kanji and then finding out what the possible readings could be. Again, this is kind of small, so I'm going to blow it up a little bit. You can see a little bit more clearly. This is organized according to the 214 Kangxi radical system also. There's an index in the back of the book, so if you need to find the kanji, you have no idea how it's read, you can use the same skills that you have developed using your Nelsons to use the O'Neill's Name Dictionary. So what do we have? Well, for example, here we have a kanji whose discrete number is 715. And then after the character and its number, we have that N in a square bracket. And that means that the character has been approved for use in names. And then after that, we have a whole bunch of choices. Masashi, which is a male name. Masaru, which is also a male name. Sakan, Akira, Sakae. And then in parentheses, Sho Masayoshi Aki Masusuke yo Atsusaka. Okay, so let's break this down. That character alone, if you saw it in a name, could be read Masashi or Masaru or Sakan or Akira or Sakae. Yeah, thanks a lot. That helps. But there it is. It's better than nothing, right? How are you going to figure out which one is correct? Again, if you're like me, you thank your lucky stars that there is the internet, and you try Googling the person's name, and you try and figure out if somebody's glossed it, maybe in a library catalog or something like that. Now, what about the stuff? What about the readings in the parentheses? Those are readings that are possible when that kanji is combined with another one. So, for example, one of the possible readings is masu. And so if we take this kanji and we compare it, or we combine it with this one, we would read that masu ichi, and that's a male name. But we could take that character and combine it with this one, in which case we would read the name Akiko, and it would be a female name. So this is how all of these characters are organized. And there is a handy list of abbreviations and signs for all the different possible notes, indicators that they have here in the dictionary. All right, so that's how you kind of learn how to read names. It helps a little bit. Now I'd like to discuss a few cultural issues associated with names this is handy to know when you're working in a Japanese context. In Japan, one person in each marriage must take his or her spouse's name, and this is distinct from, for example, the Chinese system in which married couples maintain their birth names. And the Japanese system is very similar, of course, to the system that we're accustomed to in the United States. Usually, the woman takes the man's name, but sometimes the man takes the woman's name. This doesn't happen very often in the United States, very rarely, as a matter of fact. I've only known one person who's ever done that. This happens when the woman's family has no male heir and needs someone to continue on the family line. So usually, if a man takes the woman's family's name, and I'm going to be saying more about that in just a second, he is probably not going to be the firstborn in his own family because, generally speaking, the firstborn male is expected to carry on the family line traditionally in a Japanese family, but say a second or a third or whatever born son can then be sent off to another family and become the head of household for that particular family. Let me explain a little bit more about what that means. But before I do, I'll say parenthetically that there are exceptions to this rule if a Japanese marries a foreigner. Japan's getting a little more flexible about foreigners marrying Japanese and living in Japan and being part of the fabric, if you will, of society. But there are still some exceptions to this rule, and they're much more complicated than we need to get into. Okay, so this brings me to the concept of a koseki. This is something that we don't have in the United States. Koseki is usually translated as a family registry. The koseki, what role does it serve? It simultaneously fills the function of birth certificates, death certificates, marriage licenses, and the census. These are standards in the American context, these sorts of documents, and the koseki kind of takes place of all those things. A typical koseki has one page for the household's parents and their first two children, and then additional children are recorded on additional pages. Any changes to that information have to be sealed, have to be stamped, if you will, by an official registrar, a government registrar. So koseki, this family registry, is typically kept in a municipal office as the formal record of particular households. So the following items are recorded in a koseki according to the law of family register. You'll have the family name and the given name of the members, the date of birth, the date of records, and the causes. In other words, changes and what caused those changes, so marriage, death, adoption, things like that. Names of the father and the mother and the relation to them. And if adopted, names of the adoptive father and mother. And if married, whether a person is a husband or a wife. And if transferred from another koseki, the former koseki. So in that previous example, if a man marries a woman, takes on her surname, then he's officially transferred from his family's koseki to her family's koseki. So that's what I mean by he's transferred. And also, the terminology that you may read or hear when that happens is that he has been adopted into his wife's family. So normally in English, when we hear the word adoption, we think about children. But adoption in this context also includes adults. So to adopt here in the Japanese context is simply to move from one family registry to a second family registry. Your age is kind of irrelevant. And the final thing in a koseki is a registered residence. Where do you live? So if you move, then you have to tell the authorities that you're moving. The koseki is a time-honored tradition in Japan. It's been around a very long time. And it's something that the Japanese really take for granted, and something that foreigners really have a hard time wrapping their brains around. So now I want to switch gears again and talk a little bit about historical naming practices. We've been looking at trends a little bit, but separate from that, there's still much in the way of traditional uh, convention and custom in bestowing names. In early Japan, a man from the upper ranks would often have the following. First, he would have what's known as a yome or a domyo, a child name, which was used until he came of age. And then he would also have a tsusho, a current name, and finally a jitsumyo or a true name. Now, what are these things and how are they used? Well, the child name is given by the parents. So the child is born, the parents give the child a name. The current name then was commonly used with the commonly used name in adulthood. Once somebody came of age, then they would be using the current name instead. And the true name was chosen by the person himself upon adulthood. It was considered an intimate name. It was rarely used, but the jitsu means true, right? That's my true identity. So when one became an adult, one then chose a name that one felt was particularly fitting. And this is early Japan. Now, in addition to this practice across Japanese history, we also see the Japanese adopting a Chinese system, if you will. And we're going to see examples of this in the biographical dictionary entry that we're going to look at in a couple minutes. So in this Chinese system of names, there are different categories. There's what's known as an azana or a ji. And yeah, that's the kanji no ji. That's a name that's bestowed upon somebody by a master or a teacher. So if you're a disciple, your master, your teacher might give you an azana or a ji. There's also what's known as a go, as in bango no go, and that's a name that you choose yourself. Like writers choose a pen name or artists can choose a pen name. Scholars in Chinese history and Japanese history often will choose a name, a go. And then there's homyo, which is the names of Buddhist priests. Okay, so there's sort of a separate category for the Buddhist priests. Now, in modern Japan, these practices have all but disappeared. The exception is the posthumous name, of which two types are still important, the okurina and the kaimyo, the conferred name and the precept name. So you might still run into those. I say in modern Japan, when did these really fall out of favor? I would say end of the Meiji period. The okurina is a name that the emperor or some other amazing Erai exalted person takes after death. So for example, Hirohito was called Hirohito while he was alive, at least by the Americans, but then he's called the Showa emperor after he died. And a kaimyo is a Buddhist posthumous name. People still care about getting kaimyo. And of course, authors and artists sometimes take pen names, alternate names, a pen name or an artistic name. I don't think that's ever going to change. And of course, we see that tradition in the West also. So a little bit about the history of names, and this brings us full circle back to the beginning of the lecture in which we were looking at the tremendous number of surnames that exist in Japan, over 100,000, which is just a remarkable contrast with China and Japan. But in Japan, actually, most surnames are relatively new. So to try and put this history in a little nutshell, the imperial and the upper-ranking families had surnames fairly early on. So we're talking about the Heian period. The Fujiwara, that's a name that you should be familiar with if you know anything about Japanese history. The Fujiwara were the most prestigious family in the Heian court, and they were inextricably tied with the imperial family. Then there was also the Taira and the Minamoto. But surnames were restricted to the aristocracy, the military, and a few select artisans. And by saying that, I'm really kind of making a huge sweep across time. And I'll give you a little more detail in a minute. But what I mean by huge sweep, all the way from the Han into the Tokugawa, okay? What about everybody else? What about those peasants out in the field, et cetera, et cetera? Those folks are just using their given names or some combination of what I was talking about, a childhood name and a usual name and a tsusho and things like that, okay? But we're not looking at a situation where there's consistently a surname and a given name. So if you're a peasant, you have a name. You don't have two, if that makes sense. So the two types of names given to groups within society back in early Japan, we're talking the Nara period. So this is the 8th century. Generally, the Nara period is identified as early 8th century till the late 8th century, not even 100 years. These two types of names were the uji, to indicate a clan, and a kabane, a hereditary title of nobility. Kabane were used after the name of the uji and before the given name. Between the uji and the given name, one often sees a no, as in Taira no Kiyomori. Okay, there's that Taira name that we were just looking at, and you should be familiar with Taira no Kiyomori, because Taira no Kiyomori was the wonderful villain from the Tale of the Heike. When the Fujiwara clan spun off sub-clans, let me say a little bit about that. I always explain it this way, and I'm probably offend historians as I do it, but simply put, what happened was that the Fujiwara clan was extensive. It was of course supported by tax money, and eventually it just became untenable to have such a huge extended clan. And so eventually what happens is the Fujiwara spin off those distant cousins, and they create separate clans and gave them surnames. And a lot of those those surnames ended with the kanji that is read here, Fuji, but its onyomi is to, to indicate that connection. So if your surname had that kanji in it, then there is some sort of kind of tenuous connection to the Fujiwara family. So as an example, here's a whole bunch of surnames, many of which are still really common in Japan today, that use that character. Ato, Ando. Ando is really common. Ito, super common. Eto, Endo, also super common. Saito, Sato. And so that's where that particular combination comes from. And actually, you can think about some of these, like this one, Endo. It's far away from the Fujiwara. Maybe they were, I'm not sure about the etymology of it, but I'm guessing that the Endo geographically were further away from the capital. Okay, so how about the Kamakura through the Tokugawa? That what we were just looking at in the previous slide is really the Heian period. And now I'm going to, again, make a huge general sweeping statement about a big chunk of Japanese history. Military families in rural areas added the name of their locality often to their names. But commoners were still limited to using only their given names. We don't read too much about commoners in the literature, so it's easy to read Japanese literature all the way back to the Kamakura period and assume that surnames were de rigueur, that everybody had them, because the people who get mentioned in the literature are the upper echelon, the top crust of society, the folks who belong to either samurai military families or to the aristocratic echelon. But actually, still throughout this period, the commoners are limited to just using their given names. So now I'm going to fast forward all the way to the end of the Tokugawa period. In 1868, that restriction of people not being allowed to have surnames, I mean, it was a big honor actually to have a surname. that was lifted, and all Japanese then, from that point forward, were permitted to take a surname if they chose. And this must have been largely due to the example of the West, in which most people have surnames and given names, and the Japanese were so rapidly modernizing and westernizing that this seemed kind of a natural move. And so they decided, okay, we'll lift that ban. Now anybody can decide that they can have a surname if they want it. And then in 1875, it turns out a lot of people didn't really care. They didn't take a surname. But this made things difficult for the government. I mean, if nothing else, imagine trying to take a really good census and keep track of your population. And so in 1875, the government required everyone to take a surname. You wake up in the morning and now there's a new law. Okay, you have to have one of these. And so what they did was the government sent out officials across the land to enforce this rule and essentially help people pick out names or assign names to folks who were illiterate or didn't really know what they were doing. If I had a time machine, I would love to go back to this point in Japanese history. So the names that people typically chose had something to do with where they lived, like Tanaka, I'm in the fields because I'm a farmer all the time, right? Or Yamada, I'm in the fields next to the mountains, I'm in the mountain fields. Or sometimes they would end up with a surname that was connected with whatever their profession was. Anyway, the majority of the population at this point in Japanese history is still a farmer peasant society. And so consequently, many Japanese, even today, have kind of surprisingly pastoral surnames. Even though most Japanese today live in an urban environment, their names sound like they're living on a farm. And one of the funnier stories that I've heard about this whole process is that these officials would go out to the villages and they essentially were given a mandate. I have to give everybody a surname before I move on to the next village. And that was it was an onerous task. And so sometimes an entire village would be assigned the same name by a government official because it was too much to give each individual something distinct. And so he just, okay, everybody who's living in this town is going to be Tanaka. Let's move on. There's also a really funny story that I read, and I can't remember where. If anybody hears this video and they know where this story is, please send me an email and tell me. This is a great example of something I should have cited in my own bibliography, and I didn't. And that is a story of people going out into the countryside, these officials going out in the countryside and being essentially at a loss for coming up with new names. They used everything they could think of. And so they just started looking around and assigning names based on whatever happened to pop into their field of vision. Like, okay, I'm going to give you the name Colgate because there's Colgate toothpaste sitting on the shelf, that kind of thing. It was a wild and wacky time in Japanese history, but the end upshot of it was that everybody ended up with a surname. Okay, earlier I was mentioning biographical dictionaries. There are a lot of biographical resources that help you find out who and what is who in East Asia. Most of these are called in Japanese a jinmei jiten. I mentioned that word before when we were looking at O'Neill's. Those are biographical dictionaries. Jinmei, not really name dictionaries, but biographical dictionaries. If you're a student here at SUNY Albany, I can tell you that we have a couple good biographical dictionaries in our library, but I can also tell you that the Minerva catalog system is lousy at finding them. And my advice for you is simply go into Minerva and as a search term type in Jinmei, Jinmei, all one word, and you'll find what you're looking for. Any other search term gives you a bunch of false hits. It's really frustrating. Okay, so there's multi-volume biographical dictionaries, single-volume biographical dictionaries. I think I mentioned when we were looking at Motohashi that Motohashi can also be a good biographical resource because Motohashi lists prominent people, particularly people who are prominent in sinology. So if you can't find information about someone in a smaller Jinmei Jiten and you have access to Motohashi, that's another place that you could look. And the great thing about Motohashi is even though it's so daunting because it has so many examples in classical Chinese. If you were looking up the name, let's say, of a Meiji period scholar, that person will probably be in Murohashi, and the entry there will be in modern Japanese. It's not going to be in classical Chinese. So it really is accessible. Now, of course, Wikipedia can be a first stop, and the internet can be a first stop. You can Google somebody's name. This has made a tremendous difference in my life. It makes finding information much quicker. But I'll say, even now in 2013, the English side of Wikipedia about Japanese people is often quite sparse, or you'll find just a Japanese page and not an English page. And depending how good your Japanese is, you may not want to slog through the Japanese Wikipedia page. The one really great thing about the Japanese Wikipedia page, though, is that it will definitely will give you the reading of the person's name. So every Wikipedia entry for a person will give you their kanji, and then in parentheses will tell you how to pronounce it. And other web pages aren't necessarily going to do that for you. So that's one reason why I can't just say, oh, don't depend on Wikipedia. All that said, even the Japanese entry on a person might be missing some useful information because, as we know, Wikipedia is run largely by volunteers, and if somebody just hasn't bothered to put that information in about a particular Japanese person, then it's just not going to be there. Okay, so let me go back to what these Jinmeiji 10 look like. What should you be looking for in a good Jinmeiji 10? There are also online Jinmeiji 10, as you'll see. Here's what we might expect. Here's the entry from the online biographical dictionary, and I've got a number of links on Blackboard to biographical dictionaries, so you can take a look at those. First, we are given the reading of the person's name, Fukuzawa Yukichi. And we're told that there's two different ways to write his name. Why? Because, he traditionally, there's a couple different ways to approach this. Traditionally, he liked to write it with the complex kanji, as we see here. And this is not the complex kanji, but it is the Kyu Kanazukai. So one might find his name written this way, Fukuzawa Yukichi, or we might see Fukuzawa Yukichi. Could be either way. And of course, as I was saying, this character and this character are the same one, just complex and simplified. Okay, the next bit of information that we get are birth and death dates, including the Nengo, if appropriate. And in Fukuzawa Yukichi's case, the Nengo is appropriate. He was born in the Tokugawa period, and so we're told he's born in 1835, which is Tempo here, and then the date. Okay. And then it tells us that he died in 1901, and it also gives us here the Nengo, which was Meiji 34. Just a quick note about that birth date. So it's Tempo 5. The year 1835 was Tempo 5. And that date is actually the lunar date. It's the 12th day of the 12th month, which is obviously not the same as the solar date. Of course, you could convert that using Nengo Calc. Turns out that it's January 10th, 1835. How would I know which is which? Well, you got to keep in mind that the Japanese switched their calendar again in 1872, so we're looking at 1835. So if I see a Nengo, I'm going to assume that it's the lunar calendar. Okay, the next bit of information that we get here is why the person is famous. Who is he? What kind of a person, why is he even in the biographical dictionary? In his case, he was a thinker of the Japanese Enlightenment, it tells us, and he was an educator and a critic. The next bit of information that we get is all the names that he is known by. Remember those different names we were just talking about? The child name. So his child name is Han. His Azana is Shii. It's written with these characters. Shii, to give us the reading right there. His goal was Sechi. And then it also tells us that at some point he had the surname of Nakamura. Now, some people have multiple asana and multiple go. So if you're looking at an older entry, maybe from 100 or 200 years earlier, and you see that, don't be too surprised. Okay, so that's that information. The next thing that we get is his birthplace and his lineage. Where was he born, and to whom is he related? And then we get important events in his life in chronological order. What important things did he do? What important things happened to him? And that kind of thing. And then if we continue on to the next page, we're also given a bibliography of his major publications. He was a very active scholar. He published an awful lot. This is not a comprehensive list. There's a lot more that he produced. And then we get a famous quotation from him about learning. Next, a distinction that was bestowed upon him as like an award, if somebody's received any sorts of awards. Political activities of his. He was active here, it tells us, in the Conquer Korea debates. And then a posthumous distinction. His portrait was put on the 10,000 yen banknote in 1984, and we saw that when we were looking at numbers in the last learning module. Okay, so that's what we should expect from a typical entry in a Jinmeiji 10. It's very different than the kind of entry that we see in O'Neill's Japanese names. Again, a lot more detail, right? Fukuzawa in O'Neill's Japanese names indicates that he is male and that he is historical and literary, and that's about it, okay? Finally, I want to finish up with selected biographical resources in our particular library at SUNY Albany. We do have a Nihon Jinmeiji 10, and we have a book called Japanese Names, a Comprehensive Index by Characters and Readings. We also have a few other Jinmeiji 10. We have a multiple volume Jinmeiji 10. The one that I've listed here is a single volume one. I think it's much easier to use, so it's the one that I would recommend. Plus, of course, there are many online resources. In Blackboard, under Useful Links, you'll find 4 of these. These are all in Japanese. And to show you an example, this is the first one that actually sometimes comes up with the wrong encoding. If that happens, remember the quick video sitting on Blackboard about changing the encoding of your browser. You'll have to go to View and then change the encoding like that if you don't remember. Okay. This one's organized according to the Goju Unzu. So we start up here on the right, a, I, U, E, O, ka, ki, ku, ke, ko. And the others are much of a muchness in that respect. Even though this one has a title in English, it is really in Japanese. And it also is organized according to the Goju Unzu. So those are also really useful resources, and I'm going to ask you to use at least one of them for the homework assignment. So that's our learning module on names, and we'll move on to the next unit.